All right, well, welcome to Plaster Damp Boxes. I'm Kala Stein, and I'm the Director of Ceramics here at Sonoma Community Center. Sonoma Ceramics is our program, and we have other art programs here, and also community theater, music, all sorts of stuff. We've been running virtual workshops since April 30th, and have a great lineup coming up in September, August, September, October, November. We have a bunch of stuff on the schedule and are adding more stuff too. So I also want to recognize that we're on the indigenous lands here in Sonoma Valley of the Mayakama and Pomo Indians. Let's see, so we're doing something a little bit different today with the video. I pre-recorded the demo of me working with Plaster. So I'm going to be playing that video for you by a screen share, and then I broke it up into about 8 parts, and I'll be able to answer your questions as we go through the video and also re-demonstrate anything at the end. And this is a little bit different than the live demo. I just figured it's a little bit difficult to do live demo with Plaster because of the waiting time. So in this way, you know, it's just an experiment kind of, but I think it's a really good way to do it. And then the video itself, the YouTube video that we made it on Wednesday. That will be pure demo. So you'll get that video to watch afterwards, and you'll also get this class video. So you'll have 2 videos if you want to watch the more interactive version or just the demo version. So I think it should work pretty good. We're happy with the way it came out, and I'll be able to screen the questions as you guys have them too. I'll be able to pause the video as well. So I'll be doing a little bit of both. Okay. I thought I would start a little bit with an artist talk about my work, and it'll all make sense with the plaster element too. This isn't really a mold making class, as you know. This is very basic, how to make a damp box, but I thought I'd put some content in there.
Did you already teach your mold making class?
Mold making starts August 4th, and it meets on Tuesdays for demo, and then we meet on Fridays for discussion and troubleshooting. So that class is still open if anyone's interested in doing intro to mold making.
Are you going to just be doing a 1-part mold? Or are you going to go into multiple?
I'll go into multiple. Yep.
Good.
So the idea with that class, by the end, you can have either multi-part molds, or you could have a 1-part if you're starting from, you know, ground zero, and then have a 1-part and have a multi-part by the end of the 4 weeks, assuming that you'd be able to work in your studio between the classes. So that's kind of how I'm pacing that one. All right, so I'm going to do a screen share. I'm just going to show you a few things on my website and do the artist talk that way. I started slip casting when I was an apprentice to Rick Hensley and Donna Pulsino, and they're 2 potters that live in Floyd, Virginia. I did a 2-year apprenticeship with them. And this is the work I made when I started, well, actually when I ended with them. So I was with them for 2 years, and then I went to graduate school after that. And these are salt and pepper shakers. And the shaker elements at the top, those are cast from plaster model. So I actually took a piece of plaster and cut it and sanded it into that shape. And then I made tray forms for underneath them. And the salt and pepper shaker is a 2-part mold, but the trays are each a 1-part mold. And my work was all about sets and settings and the table and tabletop sculptures. So I wanted to alter the pieces as they were coming out of the mold, since I was putting so much time into the mold making and model making. A lot of times people don't alter after they make the piece. So I was cutting the rims and layering them and stacking them in different ways to make unique sets and pieces. And so that really started my interest in mold making. And when I was there, I was able to assist a master mold maker at Penland School of Craft for 2 weeks. And through him, I really learned a lot of different tooling techniques and, you know, using a bandsaw to cut the plaster and using a lot of just different tools that I wasn't familiar with them from the pottery studio.
How thin are, with a lot of these, they look like you're dealing with very, very thin castings.
I like, well, I usually work the rim, so the rim looks thinner. So like the wall
Okay.
won't be as thin as that top edge.
Okay.
So I started out in ceramics and throwing. And as a thrower, there's a certain type of rim that comes off of the wheel, like a very refined, soft, you know, it can be very delicate. And so I always think about the rims like being tapered, kind of like maybe a thrower would do.
Mm-hmm.
When I cast, it really depends on the size of the piece in terms of the thickness. So just like you would make anything else, you don't want to make a super thick cup or something small, but as you get bigger, you're going to make a thicker wall. And with slip casting, you have that possibility. You just leave the slip in there longer to get a thicker wall. So I'll skip up here to Convivium. This was my thesis piece at Alfred University. I went to graduate school there after working with Rick and Donna, and part of my exhibition, which was called Convivium, well, the whole exhibition actually, is this 40-foot long table with 1,500 goblet forms on it.
Wow.
And they're all slip cast. I made the model out of wet clay, like regular clay out of a bag. And, you know, I went there slip casting functional pieces. And when you're in graduate school, you really get pushed beyond your comfort zone. And so I kind of took on this space as an installation space, but still working more or less with the idea of a functional form. And these are like 9 inches tall, and they're cut in half, almost like you would divide an object in half if you were going to flip cast it or make a mold of it. And then the tabletop, I designed the table, my husband made it, and it has a glass top. So the shadows would go through the pattern of the goblets and shine on the floor. And so the idea was, you know, this potential moment right before maybe a banquet or a gathering. So this perfect moment, stillness that's full of potential and the setup for something bigger to happen through gathering. And after that, I wanted to scale it down a little bit and really began to start with the idea of working with modular molds. And this is something, there's a few artists out there that do modular mold making, but it's basically where you can make a mold that can be rearranged each time it's cast. So traditionally in industry, molds are made to make serial objects, serial runs of the exact same object. But that's limiting for artists who are mold makers, because we don't want to necessarily make the same exact object the whole time, although the process may lend itself to our work. So with these pieces, I can actually rearrange the mold parts to make one-off objects. So this is one piece, and it has, each surface is a part of plaster. And then this is, each zig and zag of this piece is a separate unit. So it kind of has this sense of infinity or taking up larger space. Altogether, I think this piece is like 4 feet long. but essentially it's smaller units that are vases that are placed together. Same with this, the blue unit is all one piece, hollow inside, and then the gray unit is also one cohesive piece. And then this is 3 units, so each pair is a 2-part mold. And so that's kind of what I'm working on these days, more or less, in terms of my work. This is more recent work where I wanted to bring pattern into the pieces. I'm not really an illustrator and I don't do narrative drawings or anything like that. But I do like geometry. I'm interested in architecture and structure. So in this piece, I used a CNC mill to emboss a piece of plexiglass, and then I poured the plaster onto that plexiglass to get this embossed texture, which is then part of the mold. And then I add on some additions to the surface. And so these pieces are very architectural, sort of feel like something built, but also unbuilt at the same time. And these are all still the modular mold system. So it's really cool because as you look around the piece, it's completely different on each side. And then I also make functional work still. So the cups, anything round that I make originates from the wheel, from throwing a model. And then I make a mold of the model, of the clay model from the wheel.
So those handles were attached separately, right?
Yes, I always attach my handles separately. To make a cup or anything with a handle that's slip cast, it's, I mean, it would eliminate a step of attaching the handle, but it leaves a weird indent on the inside that I don't really like at all. So I always attach my handles separately. And then they're all a little different too, which I kind of like. And all these little pieces are added on after it's cast. So I still
now,
like.
Is that a vase?
Yes. Yep. Cups. The vases are generally, when I make them, like 12 to 20 inches tall. That's sort of the maximum amount of slip that I can pick up in a bucket and dump into the mold, is a mold about that size. So that's a big limitation with slip casting, is like how much material do you want to pour into your mold.
20-inch vase is a pretty big size though.
Yeah, I mean, it shrinks a lot. So then it's down to like 18 after the firing. And so any lines that you see on these pieces, that's all a result of where the mold parts come together. And I like honoring the process through showing those lines, and it also creates another layer of geometry on the forms. So there's that body of work. And then in 2017, I was able to do a residency with some of my grad school mates in Bolton Hill neighborhood, which is in Baltimore, Maryland. It's a historic neighborhood that is largely built of red brick and terracotta. And so this was a National Endowment for the Arts grant for us to go into this historic neighborhood and pull from the neighborhood our inspiration, and then work in the studio with digital fabrication and ceramics. So it's kind of an interesting grant opportunity. It was also the National Park's 100th anniversary that year, I think. So they were interested in artists going in and working either at historic national monuments or parks. And so that was how that came about. And these are some of the images of the architecture in Bolton Hill. We dug local clay there that we sampled and made terrace gelata out of. We got to go to this big clay pit. And something that was really interesting about this location is they had all these different types of clay there. Typically, you wouldn't find varieties of clays in one location, but this particular geographic area, from erosion or early land movement, had a lot of different types. So we sampled, I want to say, like 6 or 8 different types of clay. And you can see in the raw state how different it is. So my project there was to do the largest vessel form that I've ever made, because I had an assistant that could help me with the digital design and modeling, so digital modeling, and then the output. So this is a 16-part mold, and each section is the same, and it just revolves around to be a complete circle. So my idea was to create the angle where these pieces could come together digitally, so it was very accurate as it went around. So something I didn't really want to do by hand. So this is a 3D printer. It's a plastic printer, and it basically plots coils. This is just, one glitch that happened. And so I came in the next day and it was like looking like this. So this is just like learning the tools in the studio. But each section of my larger piece took about 8 hours to print, and there's 3 sections. So it's pretty time consuming. It's the first time I had worked with 3D printing. These are my collaborators, the clay pit, and then this is the top part of that vase. The white piece is at the bottom. So this is the positive model, and the plaster gets poured onto that. So I was basically making a piece that represented, the red and the white part represents the positive, and then the plexiglass sides creates a wall to pour plaster into. So this is like very advanced mold making. I was basically making a tool, like a mold making tool, or a mold for a mold. But it was really interesting to do it this way because the plastic releases the plaster so well, and I could take off those top sections and then shape the mold. So any extra weight of the mold was moved at this stage, and I could handle each part a little bit easier. And these are the mold parts that came out of that machine, that little tooling machine. And so 16 of these makes a whole round. And this is the mold together before I used it. I think it's just a beautiful mold on its own. It's very architectural on its own. I almost am more interested in this than the end result. But, that's part of the process is figuring out where the good stuff is.
I like the 2 of them combined.
Yeah, it's interesting to see them together.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it didn't work as a slip casting mold because the curve towards the bottom is really steep, and so it collapsed. This is the first mold I poured, but it was easy for me to tell early on that it was not worth trying to slip cast it, so I made it into a press mold, which you don't have to do any altering. It's just when it's a slip mold, you can just use it as a press mold. So this is when it collapsed. And I mean, this thing is huge. So when I took the slip out of it, I had to use a shop vac to suck out the slip, because there's no way I could pick it up and dump it. And then this is using those mold parts as press molds. So I first rolled slabs on the slab roller, and then I pressed it into the mold, and then I put the mold back together and strapped it together, and then went back in on the inside and added some reinforcement at the seams to hold it together. The light bulb is in there to help dry the bottom, so it dries evenly. And then this is it out of the mold. So it's a pretty interesting process. And really in the end, it was fortuitous that I couldn't slip cast it because I slip cast porcelain. And for the piece to relate back to the Bolton Hill neighborhood, it just made a lot of sense that it was terracotta. So I was happy to go back to that. So just testing some colors. The other thing we did there that was really interesting was we tested basically sintering glazes with a laser cutter machine. So we would put glaze on a tile and then put it in a laser cutter and basically draw a design. And wherever we drew the design with a laser, it would fire the clay or the glaze in those locations. So for this tile, it was a white tile. We put black glaze on it, put it in a laser machine, and it drew over where the black lines are, and then we washed away the rest of the glaze. So you can do, it was basically like super localized firing with a laser.
So you're creating a resist.
No, you're actually firing only where the lines are. You're firing with the laser.
Oh.
Yeah. And in this case, we had two different clays. This is the terra sigillata made from the local clay. And the terra sig, because it's so thin, it just burned away completely on the lower part. So on the lower part, it went all the way through the terra sig and left the white clay, kind of like a sgraffito effect. Instead of carving, you can just do it with a laser. So these are just some experiments we did when we were there. This isn't too clay oriented, but I think it's worth mentioning is this is another project I did when I was there. I was these are decorative cast iron that's all over the city. There's a very old foundry there that's still in operation. And so these decorative grates were everywhere. And I would just basically like pull out part of the ornament. So isolate part of the ornament to find an interesting shape. And I did a series of 6, I think. And then I cut out extruder dies with those shapes. So this one was not a success, but these, I had to scale it down a little bit. So these dies go into our extruder and you can push clay through it to get that ornament extruded. And my idea was, is if they were blown up to be huge, they would be really cool park furniture or playground pieces. So like giant pieces of ornament scattered in the landscape. And these are some of the extruded forms. And then the last thing I'd like to show you is last summer, I went to Jingdezhen, China to teach a 3-week workshop and to do a sabbatical residency. So I was there for 6 weeks total. And if you don't know what Jingdezhen is or where it is, it's southeastern China, about an hour and a half plane ride from Shanghai. And it's the porcelain capital of the world. So it's where porcelain was first mined and first made. And they're still known for their porcelain production there. So these are some pieces I made when I was there. Ironically, I didn't actually work with the porcelain directly because there's so many ceramic industries there. I was able to act more like a designer and go in and kind of like purchase things off the shelf and alter them, have custom decals made. And so that's really what I played around with. So these are wall assemblages made from parts of tea trays. And the tea trays are, I don't know, maybe like 8 inches to 12 or 18 inches. And they come in greenware or they come bisqued. So I could buy them raw and then cut them. And then I can buy my glaze separately and glaze the pieces and then put them together. So I did a whole series of these.
How big are they?
The smallest ones are about 10 inches or so, and the bigger ones are about 20 inches. Like this is a smaller one. And Jingdezhen is amazing. So there's the glaze neighborhood where you go and you can buy your glazes. Every single store is a glaze store with bottles of glaze pre-mixed, and they just fill up an old water bottle for you, or an old 2-liter bottle with glaze, and you take it back to the studio and glaze. There's the Bisqueware district, there's clay district, there's blanks, like blank fired commercial pieces. They have everything there. Or you can make your own work, you can have molds made there. It's really amazing. This is the largest piece I did with the trays. And I didn't really have like an idea about them, but a lot of the locals, the Chinese people, were saying, oh, it's calligraphy. This is like a new take on calligraphy in ceramics. So I thought that was pretty interesting that these looked calligraphic, or even could relate to language in a way. Another project I worked on there was this waterware series, and I had a series of decals made from photographs that I took of Lake Ontario, and that's near where I grew up. And so the blue is one photograph that I took, and then I would cut up the photograph and put it onto the plate that I purchased and refire it. And this is the original image. And the quality and technology they have to make decals and really anything in ceramics is really incredible. So I'm really lucky and happy to have these beautiful decals to work with. I had about 50 sheets made, so I'm working my way through them. I'm doing a lot of these for dinnerware. And then these are some of the tea trays that were not cut. And then the cup shape is a cup that I actually did carve the plaster model by hand. And then I casted the cups with the porcelain that they use, the kaolin porcelain. And their porcelain goes to cone 13. So it's just a beautiful white, super dense porcelain. It's lovely. Some more plates. There's also Decal Street, so a whole decal neighborhood where you can buy pre-printed commercial decals. So this is a piece I did with some of those decals, and I I isolated some of the flowers and then collaged them all together, and then did a PVD firing. PVD is kind of like gold luster, but they have kilns that anything that goes in the kiln will be completely gold when it comes out, unless you put this slip layer over it. It's just like raw clay. You paint it on to mask where you don't want the PVD. So it's not gold, but I believe it's more similar to like chrome plating on cars. So that was just another interesting thing to work with. This one too, I cut out like thousands of those little curly cues and collaged them together. It was just one little part of the decal. There's my tray store. This is an abandoned factory with all molds in it. So I went in, to me, this was like, it was a beautiful tragedy of this abandoned factory, and these just reminded me of like, of gravestones or grave markers for what was made there and the workers that were in production. So I spent quite a bit of time there, and I ended up doing rubbings of the insides of the molds to kind of pay homage to them and the history of the place. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed that.
Thanks.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the plaster video now. So like I said, I have this in 8 parts and each part is labeled in the video. If you have a question during the video, you can chat it to me in the chat feed. And then I'll pause after the end of each section, or maybe mid-section if I forgot something, but I think the end of each section will make sense. And then I can answer as we go also. So we'll just try it. Like I said, we haven't done this before, so this will be a new process. And I think the audio should work too. I guess that's something that I didn't think about, but let me know if you can't hear it.
Can't hear it.
Can't hear it.
No.
No. It's echoing now.
And now there's no sound again.
Was that better?
No, no.
Started with, and as soon as you put the lid on, it's gonna.
Yes.
That's
That
good.
worked.
Hi, I'm Kala Stein, and I'm here to teach you how to make a damp box today using plaster. So what are damp boxes? Damp boxes are just a Tupperware plastic bin that has a tight-fitting lid for keeping your work either very wet or leather hard for a long period of time. So the principle is that the plaster that you pour in retains all the water that you started with, and as soon as you put the lid on, it's going to contain that water in the box and create a microclimate that's very, very wet. So you can make different size damp boxes. This one might be really good for handles or sprigs. This one might be better for vases or cups. So I recommend, if you're really enjoying using your damp box, to have a few different sizes depending on what you need. Today I'm going to show you probably this one and this one. I'm going to show you 2 different ways to mix plaster. One is a more measured way that is typical for slip casting with multiple part molds. And then the other way is a little bit more basic and less measuring. I'll just go through the tools that I use for very basic plaster mixing. You need a scale of some sort, and this is to measure the water to plaster ratio, which is critical for absorption and strength of your plaster. I use a cordless drill with a small mixer end, like a 3-inch mixer end. USG recommends about a 3-inch mixer end for anything under 50 pounds in terms of a 50-pound batch. So 3 inches is going to do the trick for that. If you don't know if your table is level, you can just at one time, use a level to check the table, make sure it's really not out of whack. But it's not really that necessary for making a damp box. It'll just make it prettier. A scoop for the plaster. I also like to have some rubbing alcohol. It pops the air bubbles that are on the surface of the plaster once you pour it. And any spray top will fit right onto the bottle. So that's a nice combo, like handmade tool there. Measuring device. Your plaster chart that you received with the class. A metal rib for cleaning up plaster or scraping the surface if things aren't very even. Sharpie. Some kind of mask just to keep the dust down. And a calculator or a phone with a timer. And a rubber mallet, which is also optional, but will help you get the air bubbles out later. You also want to have access to warm water. So you want the water to be about 100 degrees, and that's like bath water for a baby. That's going to help activate the setting process with the plaster. And that's when you get the quickest set time. So for our purposes, we can do that. There's no reason we need to do a longer set time. For setup, I like to use a non-porous surface. So I have a melamine board here that I just got from the hardware store, and it's a non-porous surface, and the edges are particle. So I don't really get plaster on the edges because that will expand it, but the top is a pretty durable surface. Plexiglass or regular glass works, also polished stone, if you have a nice surface like that. And this creates just a nice work area, and I can remove this board and store it very easily in the studio for when I'm not working with plaster. So it's a really great way to bring out my plaster table, which is just the covering of a table. I don't need a whole separate zone for that. In my studio, I will make molds a few times a year and make a bunch of molds at once. So when I get out all of my plaster tools, they're out for a period of time, and then I put it all away and do a really deep clean of the studio. You've probably heard that plaster is really bad for clay studios because the plaster can get into the clay. And really the worst case scenario for that is if a piece of plaster breaks off and ends up in the clay, like a chunk of plaster. So that's what we want to really be careful of. And with the damp boxes, there's not too much of a risk of that happening, but just keeping things clean, and when you do handle plaster slabs, to make sure that the edges are rounded and not brittle.
Any questions about that?
So far, so good.
Okay. So number one rule, no plaster in the clay.
Okay, next I'm going to talk about the plaster chart that I gave you. This I like to put in a little plastic sleeve so it's just durable and I can use it over and over. The nice thing about this plaster proportion chart is that it shows the cubic inches, the total, the plaster, and the water. A lot of charts that are out there, you might just see the water, the plaster, and the cubic inches. When I'm in a mold making rhythm, I like to weigh out my water and then just put the plaster right into the water. So it saves me a step from weighing them both out separately. Today I'm going to show you how to weigh them out separately and then combine them, just because that's a really good way to get started and it reduces the error. So also on the chart, we have how to find cubic inches. So how to find the volume of whatever you're going to pour your plaster into. So you want to do that ahead of time. And a good rule of thumb for a damp box is for the slab to be about 1.5 inches thick. So it's thick enough that it's not brittle and it won't crack, but it's also thin enough where it's not super heavy, especially if you're going to have to move it around a lot in your studio. I like to use clear bins too, I should mention, because then you can see what's in there. You know the weight to expect when you pick it up, and you can kind of keep tabs on things without peeking inside. So it saves a little bit of time. So to find cubic inches, I'll get out the big box. First gonna mark 1.5 inches from the bottom. And I'm just gonna use the Sharpie this is where I'm gonna pour up to. And it's okay if I go beyond that, but it's just a good gauge to have the pour line marked in the box. And this box tapers, so I'm gonna measure the inside. So I have 1.5 inches high, which I already measured. And then 10 inches by 14.5. So 10 by 14.5 times 1.5 is 217 cubic inches. And that's for this size. Now, if you look at the chart, I marked where 200 cubic inches is 1 gallon volume total. So that means when it's mixed with the plaster and the water. And for me, that's a good gauge to be able to look at my the volume of the piece that I'm pouring the plaster into, look at my cubic inches, and just be able to conceptualize what 1 gallon looks like in here. And to me, that looks pretty accurate. So you want to always kind of be aware of volume and measurements so that when you are ready to pour, you don't have a disaster. So my total cubic inches were 217, and you see that falls in between two of the lines. No big deal, you can round up or round down. It's not really that critical. A lot of times I like to have just some extra containers around. So if I do mix extra plaster, I have something to pour it into versus pouring it into a bucket and trying to remove it later. So little extra things could be found plastic containers that could make good hump molds, like this bowl, maybe a smaller one in case I don't have a lot of extra, or a bigger one. So I kind of just keep these on standby. So this is ready. Typically when you make molds, you would need to use Murphy's oil soap as a releasing agent, but because we're not taking out the slab, we don't really need to have it release. Plus it's plastic, which is totally non-porous. And if we did want to get the slab out, then it wouldn't be a problem because it's non-porous and it's flexible. So you don't need any Murphy's oil soap or any mold soap for the releasing agent. Okay, so we know how much water, we know how much plaster. And what I'll talk about next is the buckets I like to use. So these are garden buckets, and I have two different sizes. One will be for plaster and the other will be for water. I'm going to put the water in the bigger one because everything will end up in here later. And for the plaster one, make sure that it's completely dry before you put the plaster in, or else it's going to make a mess. And I prefer these buckets to regular 5-gallon buckets because they have flexibility. So when I'm pouring them, I can actually grab the handles and it creates a spout. And also the plaster, when it dries, I can crack it off just by pressing the bucket. So it makes for easy cleanup. And they're pretty much available like garden stores or the dollar store or something like that. I have a few different sizes, probably 4 different sizes.
Any questions, you guys?
Well, I just have one. I'm not sure about how we are supposed to get the plaster chart.
Oh, it was in the confirmation email that you got. Did everyone get it?
I may not just have not noticed it.
I'll make sure I send you the link again when I send you the video.
Okay, and also the containers that you have for your extra plaster, you know, do you put releasing agents in those to get the plaster out if you're going to make a hump mold or something? I mean, because you use those hard plastic. Do you need releasing agents for items like that?
Usually no.
Okay.
Usually no. If it's very textured from like years and years of use, you might want to do it just for the heck of it. You know, Murphy's oil soap is so easy to find, and it's also good for cleaning your shoes and leather and wood. It's just like, you know, one of those things that everyone should just have a container of it around. But I actually poured them, you'll see at the end of the demo, I poured into those, and I haven't taken them out yet, so we can test that later at the end in real time. But yeah, if it's super flexible, you won't have a problem at all, but those clear ones are kind of rigid, And so sometimes those have problems. And if you're in doubt whatsoever, just put mold soap on it or Murphy's and you'll be fine. Even Vaseline will work if it's very thin. When I get the buckets brand new, I actually like to put a layer of Vaseline on the inside, very thin layer. But that way, when I pour out the plaster, like it's completely plaster free on the inside. That doesn't usually last too long, but it's sort of rewarding, I guess you could say, for the first few times you use the bucket. And you don't need to use those buckets. You can certainly just use a regular bucket or, you know, any container. It just might get ruined if you don't clean the plaster off.
Okay, so now we will weigh the water in the plaster. I'm going to use a regular pound scale from the studio. Usually when you grab a pound scale, it's set to 0. So you want to make sure that you take into account the weight of the bucket, and I'll show you how to do that. That's called tearing the scale. So first I'll do the water, and I'm going to put the bucket, you see that it's on 0. And that would be for weighing clay or something. And then as soon as I put the bucket on it, that weight is registering. So typically on a pound scale, there's going to be a little dial under here. And you just turn the dial with the empty bucket until you're back to 0. It's quite easy. And now I'll put in the 5 pounds of water. Okay, so 5 pounds of water, and we'll set this aside. And next we'll tear the next bucket. It's a different weight. If you're using the same buckets, you don't need to tear them. Okay, and I'll show you a couple ways to open the plaster. There's 2 ways, basically. One would be to open it vertically like this, and this would be if you're only using a little bit at a time and you think you're going to be storing it for a long time. I recommend opening the top because it's easier to move the bag. I'm going to be setting up and making multiple molds and probably go through this whole bag in just a couple of days. So I'm going to do different type of opening and call this the book method. So just grab a sharp knife, and I'm going to cut straight down the center and then across the 2 ends, so then I can open this up, and it'll be much easier to scoop out than the other way.
I just wanted to mention that the clay suppliers sell the 50-pound bags like this, but I think a lot of them also break up the bags, and you might be able to buy the 5 or 10-pound bag as well. So that's just something you can do. And if you're local to Sonoma, we have bags that we can weigh out a custom amount for you.
All right. So now we have this nice plaster. Now, what you want to do every time you open a bag is check the plaster to make sure it's very powdery feeling. If you feel any little sand grains or anything larger than that, especially, it means it's expired. Plaster, like I said, it has a shelf life, so it could expire a little quicker if there's more moisture in the air. So for instance, if you live in a wet area where it's very humid, your plaster probably won't last as long. So I really recommend only buying what you think you'll use that up, and then buy more plaster. So that's number one. It's not worth using any expired plaster, and it's really not good for anything either. So check that texture, make sure there's no grains, and you'll be fine. So back to the chart, I'm at 200. So plaster, I want 6 pounds, 14 ounces. And I'm zeroed out. And then what I like to do too is just wear a mask of some sort. Like I said, you don't need a respirator, but I'm just gonna use my fabric face mask, and that's just gonna keep some particulates out. Because you might not be able to hear me with the mask on, what I'm gonna do is sift it into the bucket. And when I sift it, we'll do a close-up of what that looks like. I'm just basically dumping the plaster into my hand and then moving my hand like this. So the plaster is going to break up in between my fingers and land in the bucket. And then I'm going to do that again when I add it to the water. About halfway there.
Are we good? Keep moving.
What was the weight of the plaster again that you put into the 5 pounds of water? Did anybody make note?
It's in the chart. I mean, you don't really need to have that information.
Okay.
Yeah. The chart has all of the measurements of water and plaster. So I think it was 5 pounds plaster, and it's like a 70, what is it? Like 100 parts to 70 parts.
Okay.
The water ends up being a little bit more, I think.
And we use USG #1 pottery plaster. It's in this bag here. So this is what you want to look for when you buy plaster. The bag is always going to look the same no matter where you buy it, and it's available at any ceramic supply store. You want to make sure that the pottery plaster is not old, because they can have an expiration date based on the amount of moisture that they're exposed to, each bag is exposed to. So you might want to ask your clay supplier how old it is if you haven't bought it before, or if you don't know that they turn over their stock a lot. The other thing you want to do with pottery plaster is, if you have a large bag and you're not going to go through it all at once, you always want to store it in an airtight container. So either a plastic bin with a lid, or a garbage bag, or even both. That's what I prefer, a bag inside a bin. And that will just help prolong the shelf life of the plaster. So plaster is gypsum, and it's processed, it's ground up, and it's fired in a way where there's a chemical reaction that happens when you reintroduce water to the material. So in the manufacturing of the gypsum, to turn it into plaster, there's air around each fine particle of plaster. When it's shipped in the bag on the truck and then back to your studio, it settles and packs the particles together. So that's why when we mix the plaster, we want to sift the plaster from the bag into the bucket and then again into the water. So we're going to be loosening up the particles so that the water can soak each particle in the bucket. Plaster will set under any conditions. So that means if you have extra plaster and you put it down your drain, it's going to set even underwater or in your pipes. So that's the #1 rule of plaster, is do not pour it down a sink drain at all. All plaster must go into the garbage or be dried out, set and dried out and then thrown away. So that's the #1 rule of plaster. It does not have silica in it like clay does, so it's not as harmful for your lungs, but it can be very irritating. So I recommend using a mask of some sort. It doesn't have to be a particulate respirator, but just anything that would help reduce the amount that you breathe in when you're mixing. ventilation can also help with that too. Okay, here we are at the mixing station, and what I have here is I have cinder blocks, which creates a surface that's about knee high. That way I don't have to bend over a lot when I'm mixing or sifting, and it's just easier to get the heavy bucket back up to the table as well. So I'm gonna sift this through. I have my mask back on, and let's see if we can just do it this way. So I really want to sift it and get it all in there fairly quickly, evenly throughout the surface, but not in big clumps at once. And this helps disperse the plaster into the water. So you're kind of covering the surface. You want to get it all in there and fairly quickly, because the plaster that went in there first is now wetter than this plaster. Now the island that you see, this is exactly what you want. And the next method I show you is actually going to be based off of just eyeballing the island. So if you notice the size of the island and now how it's dissolving into the bottom of the bucket, it'll slowly dissolve as it sits there for 2 to 10 minutes. It'll dissolve all the way to the bottom, so there's no plaster showing above the water line. Okay, we're back, and all of the plaster is under the water now. It's been about 10 minutes, and I'm gonna set my alarm for 2 minutes and start drilling. Before I do that, I just wanted to point out something on the drill. A lot of power drills have a adjustment. This is a speed adjustment, 1 and 2. 2 is high or very fast, and you don't need it that fast. So just change that to 1. And you want to put the mixer end in, but about 1 inch above the bottom of the bucket. So it's not scraping the bottom of the bucket or the sides. And you want to have it at a small angle. And you also don't want to create a big vortex in there. So you don't want to create a funnel shape cyclone in the middle of the plaster. That introduces air. So I'm going to mix for a solid 2 minutes, set my timer, and then we'll rest after that. Okay, so it's been mixed. It's very thin still. So what I do is I let it rest for a little bit, and then I'll mix it again right before I pour it into the bucket. Sometimes at this point, I also will just check the corners of the bucket, make sure there's equal distribution. I'm just kind of scraping that stuff off. So at this point, it's like just kind of milky. And it's going to thicken up over the course of the next 10 minutes or so. It would set up much faster if it was hot, or if the drill was going faster, or if I mixed longer. So the setup time would be shortened. So now's a good time if you're pouring a mold to check your mold one more time. I'm going to pull my box out and make sure I'm ready to pour the plaster in it. So right now it's still very thin. I'm swirling my finger on the surface and it's totally leveling out. What I'm looking for is a little bit of a ridge or a trail when I swirl my finger. It's very subtle, so you probably can't see it in the video. It's just something to look for, and that's when I know it's time to pour. I also want to show you what the rubbing alcohol does. So if you notice there's bubbles on the outside, and I'm just going to give it a light spritz, and it totally dissolves the bubbles. So that's a way you can eliminate some of the surface tension and eliminate the bubbles. Not critical. I can tell it's thickening up a little bit. If you notice that on my hands, and it's going to be ready to pour, I'd say in about 2 more minutes. So I'm just going to wash my hands in a separate bucket that will not go back down the drain and get the drill back out to give it one little swirl.
Okay, so I just wanted to answer Sandra's question. Can you mix it by hand if you don't have a drill? And yes, you can. I would recommend using a stick because the plaster is slightly caustic, so it can irritate your skin. It's not a good idea to have your hand in there for a really long time. So, you know, like a large paint stick that they have, like that kind of thing. You might find that you need to mix it, you know, pretty rigorously, because part of the drilling is like you're kind of charging the plaster, you're charging that process to happen. And if you don't mix it enough, what will happen is after you pour it, there will be a little bit of water on top after when the setting begins. So it just creates a little bit of a funky, soft layer on the very top. If that happens, it's still usable. But what I would recommend is scraping off that funky, soft top layer with your metal rib. And I do that in the end also as part of a demo, so you'll be able to see that. But that's just what that is if you see the water on top, once it starts to set, it means you didn't drill it enough or mix it enough. So I'm thinking that if you're hand mixing it, it'd probably be safe to mix it for 3 minutes instead of 2. That's what I would recommend.
All right, so this looks pretty good. I'm going to give it one last drill. And that's not completely necessary. I just want to make sure anything that's settled is properly mixed. We can tap some of these bubbles too. Okay, so when we pour the plaster, we want to pour above where we want the plaster to go, in one corner. So I'm just going to focus in one corner and have a nice smooth pour the whole bucket. And I'm pouring down the edge of the bin so that it pops the air bubbles as it goes in. the last little bit in there. And I don't typically swipe it out with my hand. There's just a thin layer of plaster in there. And like I said, that can break off really easily after it sets up. So we want to eliminate some of the surface bubbles because this is the surface that we're working on. So I'm going to do a combination of things. First, going to just tap the bin on the table. Another option is to use a rubber mallet and tap it that way. And when it seems like there's no more bubbles coming to the surface, you can grab that rubbing alcohol again and just give it a little spritz. Because you want that surface to be nice and durable. Don't go crazy with the rubbing alcohol, just a little tiny bit once over is the best way to do it. And then if you have any stubborn bubbles, you can just stick your finger in there and kind of move it around a little. If you have a few bubbles remaining, not a big deal. It won't hurt anything. It'll just be a little pock in the surface, and it's not a big enough divot to chip or to break off in your clay. So as you see, we hit our mark in the front, the 1.5 inches. And at this point, it's going to take about a half an hour to set up completely. So you just want to let it be. You can come back anytime. You can come back tomorrow. You could put the lid on it now if you wanted to. And then what will happen is that you'll feel the heat. The chemical process is going to be heating up. It gets quite hot. You'll see steam even in some conditions, but it's going to heat up as it sets, and then it's going to cool down. So on the other side of the peak heat, when it's cooling, that's when it's safe to move the bin. You can put it away. You can,
Oops.
like I said,
Lost the sound.
after you pour.
I'll just back that up a little bit, sorry.
Heat, when it's cooling, that's when it's safe to move the bin. You can put it away. You could even take the plaster out at that point, which is about, like I said, a half an hour after you pour. And it's after the peak heat, and you'll be able to really tell. So just feel the box. You can even put your hand right on the surface once it starts to set up to feel the heat. It's pretty interesting. Something else the damp box method is good for is to make plaster slabs for drying out clay. And I'll show you a slab. So this slab came out of this bin. This is the footprint of it. So you can use this to dry out your throwing reclaim or slabs. You could roll, it could be a work surface. You could roll clay on it, and it would be an absorbent slab, but you'd have to let it dry out completely first before it was actually dry. And I recommend to dry it for a few days, like in the sun, prop it up so it has airflow all around it. And then that'll be a nice tool as well. Okay.
Any question about the previous part?
How difficult was it to get that plaster slab out of your box?
Not hard at all. It just fell right out because
Oh, okay.
that box is also tapered. So that also helps. But yeah, so once you move that box around a couple times, it's actually just sitting in there. It's not really like stuck on the sides.
Okay, so I want to show you the island method to mix plaster. It's where we're going to just weigh the water and not weigh the plaster. And you kind of saw that effect in the first round. So I have a smaller Tupperware bin with a lid, and this would be great for handles, sprigs, stamps, finials, maybe small tiles, anything small. I also can go a little bit thinner on the slab since it's a smaller container. It's not going to have stress as much if I move it around. Something I'm noticing though is this keeps coming up, so I'm just gonna prop up the lid so this sits flat. Okay, so I marked right here 1 inch up, and then I'll measure the inside dimension. It's 12 by 12. So when I look at my chart, I need my calculator first. When I look at my chart, 12 times 12 times 1 inch thick is 144. So 144 cubic inches, we have 140. The other thing though I want to show you that's super easy to add on to making a plaster damp box, especially if you're a hand builder or use slabs, is how to make a mold like this, a hump mold. This is just a dollar store plastic dish, and then I poured plaster into this to make this really nice oval, flat, like without a foot hump mold. And it's the same concept. Because it's plastic, I don't need to oil it. It has flexibility, so it's gonna pop right out with no problem. So I wanna compensate for this too. And I don't want to fuss over finding the exact cubic inches of this shape. That's kind of an odd shape. So I'm just gonna imagine it as a rectangle at the widest point. So when I measure this, I'll measure 6.5 by 12, and then the height, 2. 6.5 by 12 by 2. $156 plus my 144 is 300. So because this is not a rectangle, that means some of the plaster is not being, it won't fit in here. So I'm just gonna subtract a little bit for the 4 corners, just to kind of make less plaster. And I'm just gonna eyeball that. So I'll just look back at the chart and see what a couple steps down are. So I see 300, and then 2 steps down from that is 260. So that looks like a pretty good number to me based on this. And it's okay if this doesn't fill up all the way too. I don't really want the undulating edge, so I'm just gonna fill this up to whatever I have left. But I'm gonna fill this one first because this is my priority. And you can always have smaller extra dishes, but plastic works the best. You can also use metal like this bowl. Sometimes it's harder to come out if it's thicker metal though, but plastic is definitely the best way. And you don't want any undercuts either. So just smooth, uniform, one curve, and you should be fine. Okay, so we're just measuring the water. So 6 pounds, 8 ounces, and I already tared the bucket. So I have my water all prepared. I'm going to put on my mask and go over to the mixing stand. And when I put the plaster in, I'm going to be doing the same sifting technique with my hand until I get that island. So I want to go about the same pace that I was going before and make sure that I'm spreading it across the surface, getting it all in there actively so it doesn't take too long. And then when I see an island forming that's probably the footprint of a large grapefruit and maybe a couple inches tall, that's when I know. And you have to sift the plaster in pretty quickly, otherwise it will keep sinking and sinking and sinking, and you won't get the correct read on the island. So I definitely recommend the first time that you mix plaster to follow the chart with the plaster and water ratio, if not the first many times. That'll give you a better sense of the feel of the plaster and how it's supposed to behave based on those proper proportions, 70 to 100. All right, here we go. You kind of put a lot right in your hand and then sift it out. It'll help go a little bit faster. We're getting close. Probably another half scoop here. There we go, that's good. And we'll wait 2 minutes to 5 minutes and let it totally sink down to the bottom. All right, so.
Any questions about the island method? Spoiler alert, it's not as accurate. I ended up mixing extra. But you know, it's not a bad thing if you have plenty of plaster for what you really need to do, and then some extra containers.
So all the plaster is wet. You can see some is still on the surface. That's fine. I can tell it's completely saturated. I do believe with this method, it's less measured. So I probably did put a little bit more plaster in here. But I'm gonna go ahead and mix for 2 minutes and then I'll be right back. All right, so it's nice and thick now. I'm gonna spritz it with alcohol, get those bubbles off. Give it one more stir. You can see this batch is a little thicker, which just means I need to pour quicker. Okay, so I'm going to pour into one corner slowly, but kind of quickly. And because I'm reserving some, I'm only going to go up to the line that I marked. Because this is a little thicker, I can also tap this to level out the plaster. Need a little bit extra. We'll just grab this other bowl here. Okay. Now, if you pour too much in, you can always scoop it out. I would recommend grabbing a plastic cup or something small. You could scoop it out and either put it back in your bucket you mixed in or put it into a different mold. This one to me is actually looking a little high at 1 inch, but it's fine. And I only say that because the container is so small, it's about half the height, but for handles, it'll be just fine. Even smaller trays or plates would fit nicely in here. And you can even stack things in here carefully. Like I have a bin that I put my mugs in, and I can stack them rim to rim in the box. So I can fit twice as many and just go high. So that's something you can do too. You don't need to wrap your work in plastic at all. The plaster will keep it completely wet. If you're finding that things aren't drying out quite enough, you could always keep the lid cracked. Sometimes I take my pieces out to let them dry a little bit before I work on them because they're too wet in the box. And then over time, your box is going to dry out. So to re-wet it, you can literally just pour water on it until there's a thin film of water standing on top of it. And you want it to stand on top overnight to totally saturate it. And then you can just sponge off that extra water. And that's going to ensure that your plaster slab is completely wet and even. If you don't want to get it that wet, you can just dump a cup or two on at a time and kind of see how that works overnight. But usually like 12 hours, 24 hours later, you can kind of tell like how wet your box is. At the same time, if you don't need to have plaster in the box if you want to have a box that's like a slow drying box. So you don't have to have that wet slab in there to keep it wet. You can just have a box to keep your work slowly drying without a draft. And that's a nice option for these really hot California summers, hot and dry. Other modifications that you might consider are drilling holes in the lid, and that could change how things dry if you want it to dry a little bit quicker. So those are just some ideas. I'm gonna wait and show you something else. Once this sets up a little bit, if you have a really uneven top, there's a way that you can use a rib and kind of scrape it down once it gets a little bit thicker. The plaster goes from liquid to a solid, and all the steps in between can be described like sour cream, and then cream cheese, and then maybe Havarti, and then maybe Parmesan, and then something very hard. So it kind of goes in those stages, and it has different workability at each stage as well. That's really something to keep in mind if you do make press molds, because the edges are prone to chipping. So I'll show you with this mold. Right here, there's a small chip. The edges are just so prone to chipping, and this one has a nice bevel, but we can bevel that edge even more to prevent the chipping, and also to leave a little lip to grab when you want to pick this up off the table. So this isn't bad, but a chip like this is exactly what you don't want in your clay. And this is what people talk about and what they're scared about with plaster in the studio, is a little chip like this, because that's going to get in the clay and it's going to create a blowout in the clay. So wherever this little piece of plaster is, it's going to be retaining water from the atmosphere. And then when you bisque fire your piece, that little wet piece of plaster is going to explode, and a little piece of your clay will come out, so it could ruin a piece. So I'll just show you how to do that at probably the cream cheese stage on this mold. We'll just cut in on the edge and create a nice 45-degree bevel. And I'd say that's going to be probably about 10 minutes.
All right, so that was a lot. You can put your work right on the plaster, so you don't have to put a riser in there or anything. The beauty of it is like any extra water will just be absorbed by the plaster. It won't create any pools of water or wet spots. You might get a little bit of condensation on the lid or the walls, but I haven't really run into any problem with it like falling on the work or anything, but you could just wipe that off if it's a problem, or maybe let your piece dry out a little bit. I don't recommend like putting it in a spot where the sun would be hitting it, because that will probably create some weird greenhouse effect issues with condensation. So just keep it in an area that doesn't get blasted with sun, and it should be fine.
Do the boxes keep your piece at the same moisture level that you put the piece in? I mean, for instance, if you put it in really wet, it'll keep it really wet. If you put it in leather hard, it'll keep it leather hard. Or can you use it to like soften up something that's already maybe, I guess I'm just wondering if it's like kind of like a, just stops the piece right where it is.
It will stop the piece right where it is, but if I want to re-wet a piece, I spritz it with water and then put it back in there, and it will get wetter. But if you put a completely wet piece in there, like you just threw it on the wheel, like really wet, I never do that, because why would I want to keep it that wet anytime? But I think it probably would dry out a tiny bit, just because it's evening the moisture. So like, it's just acclimating everything. So that's why when you put a drier piece in there, it's going to go wetter. But if it's for me, it's like my box, and you can change the moisture content of the box by letting it dry out more. So you can play with that a little bit. The wettest it's going to be is right when you make it. unless you totally saturate it again with like the standing water on top that I mentioned. So you'll get a sense of it. But I mean, I've kept pieces. I actually went to my studio today and I had one little handle in my damp box, and the last time I made mugs was in November for our holiday sale, and it was still leather hard. And it was the only thing in the box. So I thought that was pretty funny.
How often do you have to pour water in it?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
How often do you have to keep putting water on the container?
Oh, maybe once or twice a year.
Oh, that's it.
Yep.
Thanks.
If you have a really old plaster box or plaster slab, you might need to do the overnight soak to get it wet again. But you know, this is a total game changer. I'm so glad you all are here, because for me, this is the most critical tool in my studio, because I have a full-time job and I work in my studio at nights or on the weekends, and I don't have to worry about losing a piece because it dried out too much. So, you know, it really is such an amazing addition to the studio, especially if you have a tough schedule that requires you to hold on to work for a while. And if you're attaching handles and everything like that, it just creates a homogeneous piece. So it's great. I can't speak highly enough of damp boxes. They just take up a lot of space is the negative. Anyway, we'll continue on here. Oh, do I ever have mold problems? I haven't, no. If you do, I would just recommend maybe spritzing some Clorox, you know, some bleach on it and just wiping it out. You could also let the plaster slab completely dry out, you know, in the sun, and then get it wet again. And I would guess that the mold wouldn't come back. But I would say, like, keep an eye out for it. So if you do see mold, scrape it off, or, you know, just do something to get rid of it as soon as you see it, before it gets out of control.
All right, so we have the hump mold here, and it's just starting to set up. So I'm going to test it with this altered scraper, and just bevel. And I put a piece of plastic down here, so just want to give it a nice bevel. And I can clean this up a little bit later with some sanding screen, and I'll show you that. But you can see how easy it is to alter the plaster. If this is any harder than this, I would need different tools. You can use a metal rib for this. You could even use a plastic rib. So it's very approachable to alter the plaster at this stage. Of course, it doesn't leave a very smooth line. So that's the stuff that you would want to sand off with a sanding screen later. And later being as soon as you get it out of the mold, and so it can start drying. So this looks pretty good to me. I can do a little more cleanup on the surface. This is a large rib for this shape, but you can smooth off the surface if you need to also. Now, as your plaster is setting up, if it's at this stage where it's that cream cheese or sour cream stage in between, if you have a layer of water on the top, that means you didn't mix it enough. So it means you didn't mix it long enough or fast enough. So you really want to think about mixing the plaster like you're charging the process. You're charging that chemical exchange to happen. So that agitation is really, really important. So you can really just go for it when you're mixing with the drill. You can also mix it with a stick, just like a paint stick. You could also mix it with a paint stick, and you just want to mix it longer. Okay, I'm gonna grab my slab. So if you remember, this slab came out of the box. It was poured about a year ago and we've been using it ever since. But I popped it out today and I wanted to show you if you do want to clean up your surface or if you had a lot of bubbles or just weird texture, there is a way you can clean it. You can certainly scrape it. And this is still wet. You definitely want to be tooling the plaster as wet as it can be. So if your slab dries out fully, you can actually just soak it in water overnight and then it will be nice and workable, and then you can let it dry out again if you want. So you can play with that and get it re-wet it. And I need my sanding screen, staying with multiple part mold.
Well, I did not mean to do that, but I just wanted to mention this is all extra stuff that it's optional, you know, if you do this extra cleanup and stuff, but really when you put that plaster into the box and then it cures overnight, you can put your work in there the next day. You don't have to do any sanding. You don't have to take the slab out of the box. You can just totally start using it. So let's get back to where I was.
From the hardware store, this is 120, which is a medium grit. This is a sheet like this big from the hardware store. This is 120, which is a medium grit, I believe. This is a little bit finer and this one's used a lot. They're nicer when they break in. And this is a nice material to have in the studio because it's good for plaster, but it's also really good if you have a slab plate or a cup and the bottom rocks when it's bone dry. You can put this down and you can rub your piece on it and it will sand off any uneven parts. So this is drywall sanding screen. This is 120. I would get like 120 and then a finer grit, which might be like 200, and then you should be pretty set. So the sanding screen is just like sandpaper, but it's a little bit more aggressive and it doesn't get clogged. So normally I would scrape first and then use the sanding screen. In this case, it really is fine just with the scraper. It's going to give it a nice finished edge, and then the bevels, if it won't be beveled, so you can use a Sureform or you can just use the rib and make that 45, and then go back with the sanding screen, and you can make that nice and round. And this is exactly what I would do on that oval bowl form that I just poured, and I beveled it. I would clean it up a little bit with the rib and then go back with the sanding screen. Also, if you're really working it, you just have your sanding screen in the water and you can use that too. Make sure all the gunk is off of it before you let it dry. And then you'll have a beautiful mold, or a slab, or a hump mold. I could even put this right back in the box if I wanted to clean it up, but typically I don't. I just use it as is. I might scrape it a little bit with the metal rib before I use it in case there's any crumbs or just like a weird film on the top. Just scrape that top layer off. But this piece is really good for reclaiming clay now. Nice to have that in the studio, or even drying things on. So just want to touch base on drying time. If you want to dry something out completely, Something like this slab would just take a day or so before it's completely dry. It's going to feel much, much lighter, and it's going to not feel cold. So you want to prop it up on a couple of sticks and have airflow around it, maybe set it in the sun. Same with those hump molds. They might take a little bit longer. But you'll be able to reuse these over and over and over. All right. So that looks pretty good to me. Come back over here. And I do want to mention tools and cleanup. The plaster, because it retains the moisture, it will rust your tools. So make sure if you're using your fettling knife or your rib, anything metal, that you clean your tools really well. The drill end, I tend to rinse that in the bucket that I'm going to throw away. But you can also let the plaster just accumulate on the mixing end and designate that only for plaster. Something I didn't go into was cleanup of actual plaster. This isn't quite dry enough to crack, but it will be in a little bit. I can check the yellow bucket. Okay, so the yellow bucket starting to crack off. So it makes for really easy cleanup. So I would crack it all off, and then I use a plastic spatula to scrape it all. You always want to have your bucket free of any plaster because the chips will stay in the mix and they won't break down again. So make sure your plaster bucket is clean every time. I usually just do it a little bit later because it cracks off if it's completely set up. This isn't really completely set up yet. And if you do rinse your hands and your drill end in a bucket, what you can do is let it settle overnight or for a couple days until you see clear water on the top. And then the clear water you can just dump, in your garden. In the sludge in the bottom, you can dry out more or put it in an old clay bag, something sturdy, and just throw that in the garbage. But you don't want anything to be rinsed down the drain. I always have a rinsing bowl that's metal or plastic for my hands because I know I can clean this out completely and the plaster won't go down the drain. So remember, that's the first rule working with plaster. And you can check these. So these are the two that I poured more recently, and they're just set up and they're pretty warm, but they're not at peak temperature. So you can touch them and feel it and then kind of gauge when it's done. But I wouldn't really stack these or carry these at this point because they would crumble if they twisted. So yeah, you can just leave these here in the molds even overnight and pop them out the next day, clean them up, and then let them dry out for a few days, and you'll have your own hump molds, you'll have your dry box, and you'll be in business. So I hope you enjoyed the demo. Follow me at Kala Stein Design on Instagram and Sonoma Ceramics. And I hope to see you here again soon.
Okay. I wanted to mention that I made a mold making Facebook group. It's a private group, so you request access to it, and I'll try to answer questions on here. And I also posted the chart on here, the one I was referring to. And I also included the USG websites that talk about mixing, and which are the parameters that I go by. And it also gives a info sheet about USG Plaster. So those are some good resources.
So that's Facebook?
Mm-hmm. Mold Making with Kala Stein. And this, you guys can interact on there too, but I'll check in on it regularly to try to answer any questions if you have them also. Yeah, so we have a little bit of time left. I can answer questions. I can pop out these pieces that I didn't take out of the bowl molds if you want. Any requests? Let's start with questions. If there's any unanswered questions.
I have a question.
Okay.
My question is, with the Murphy soap, I'm just not familiar at all how you apply that. Is it undiluted, or I just don't know the process.
I usually put it in a small container, like you know, what are those? A pint container, like that you would get at an Olive Bar or something. Those work really good because I just use my pottery sponge to apply it. And then I'll add maybe just a little bit of water. The Murphy's oil soap over time tends to dry out in the bottle, or sometimes you'll get a thicker batch. So I kind of just add a little water if I need to. But you don't have to worry too much about it. You don't want there to be like a thick layer of it. You just need to do one smooth layer, one thin smooth layer. Especially with the plastic, you're not going to have, it's probably not even necessary, honestly.
Okay.
Yep. And we use that for plaster to plaster parts when we're doing multi-part molds. And so it's more critical with that process when you're doing plaster to plaster that you have a really nice thick layer of the Murphys, and you don't get that by doing just one thick layer. You have to do like multiple thinner layers. And so there's like, that's where I really go into talking about Murphys, is when it's plaster to plaster. But plastic, you know, plastic is just, I hate it, but I love it. You know, will be the death of us, but it's really good for certain things. Someone has an old plaster box that got very moldy. I would recommend taking it out, letting it completely dry, and using the metal rib to scrape off the mold, because I don't think it's probably not all the way through. It's probably just a thin layer on top. So you could just remove that with the metal rib or the sanding screen, and then let it dry completely. So leave it out a few days in the sun, and then soak it overnight to re-wet it, and then put it back in the box. Or if you just want a fresh slab, you can use that old slab for something else, that like a slab for drying clay, and then you don't have to worry about that mold still living or being reactivated. Another thing you can do with your slabs is you can carve them. So you could carve them with a small tool, like sgraffito tool, and then you can press clay into that. So it's sort of a reverse stamp method. And I see people doing that too, where they might texturize a whole slab and then you can just roll clay on it, or it becomes another tool. It's kind of a cool thing. All right, well, if you want to see me popping out those other pieces, I can switch cameras.
That'd be great.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, it'll just take me a second. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay, I can't really hear you guys that much, so
We're
let me try
good.
this.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, I can hear you too. The earbuds allow me to hear you. I'll just clear this area. All right, so this is my mold from the other day and just popped right out. Is my head chopped off?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll have to adjust that. So you can see the edges. This is like the nightmare situation of what you don't want to bring into the clay studio, because look, these are all gonna just chip off. So I'll show you how to clean that up. I'm running solo today here, so I don't have Lexi to help me. I have my bowl of water and the sanding screen in here. This is the softer one that I had, so I'm going to use the coarser one at first. One more tool I need. This is one of the best tools too. It's a Sureform. It's like a rasp. This is a Cheryl mud tool, but you can also just get them at the hardware store. You can get replacement blades. That's kind of what I like, is I'd rather just have the blade, because when you work with plaster and clay, they actually wear out. So I always have like reserve blades for this, but this will be coarser than this. And so I'm going to start with this and just clean this up. Kind of doing a 45-degree angle, and then I'll soften all of the angles with the screen. So I didn't really remove much material, you can see, but so I have a nice 45 there. And the water is great because it gets a little clogged and it helps it lubricate the sandpaper. And this can be a fairly quick process. And it's pretty good. I like this bigger bevel because I can get my fingers under it when I want to pick it up if my slab is on it. This is the old one and didn't have quite the bevel here, so it's harder to pick up, and also it's chipped, which you saw before. And then the last thing you do is just, let me grab a sponge. There's like a thin layer of plaster on here from the sanding screen. So you just sponge off any funky film. Before you let it dry out. And this would take a couple of days to dry out. When I dry it, I always prop it up on something. So like 2 little pieces of wood or 2 kiln posts or something like that, just so the air circulation can go all the way around it. So this is done. I can put that. Here's the other one, and this should come out. So this is a nice chili bowl shape, you know, some kind of just cereal bowl. And again, when they come out of the mold, the edges are really sharp. So we want to eliminate that.
Sheila, would you ever use like a wax just on that very edge to keep it protected?
I never thought about that, like museum wax or something.
Or even, you know, the paint on wax that you use for resist?
Oh, I don't know if
The
that would,
Well, the Amico one that is not so water soluble.
I don't know if that would do it, honestly. I think when the chips happen, it happens with a little more force, probably. That would probably chip off the wax too.
Okay.
And you may not want the wax like touching your clay if you're planning on doing slip work or something at the green stage. So the wax could get messy. You know how it is. It just tends to get everywhere.
Right.
Yeah. So I probably wouldn't recommend that. I don't know if it would even stick to the plaster if the plaster gets wet. So, you know, if it chips, I'll show you. You can just kind of soften the chip. You can always go back and bevel it more if it is prone to chipping. You could probably kind of curb that. This one I'm not going to do such a big bevel. And then, you know, you can really alter, this is like the mold making class, but you could potentially, like if you had a bowl or a blank like this, and I've actually been thinking lately, I want to make a triangular bowl, like kind of a soft triangle, like the cups that I showed that I made in Jing Zhen last summer. It would have a triangle shaped foot. I could actually cast this as my blank and then carve the plaster into a triangle. So, you know, that probably will be the first project that I do in my mold making class in terms of making a plaster model, because you always need to start with a blank. But there, you could alter this is what I'm saying. So like you could alter the foot or make it narrower, or make it a square foot in a rounded bowl if you wanted to play around with that too in terms of hump molds. Or you could soften this if this edge, this angled edge, if you didn't like the way that looked inside your bowl, you could sand. It's kind of abrupt, so you could sand that and just soften it so that inside of that bowl has a nice soft interior. And I like to think, you know, these plastic containers, even though they're really cheap and mass produced and kind of ugly, a lot of times they have really good proportions and really good design considerations in terms of functionality. So if you're using those to make hump molds, you're getting the work of some professional utilitarian vessel designer already in your hump mold. So it's kind of an interesting process to like appropriate that work in a different way to use it for your own. So this would be done, and this would dry out too for a couple of days. Just stack those. Here's my box from yesterday. I don't know if you'll be able to see the bubble surface. There's some bubbles on there. So I think I can just make that a little bit nicer with my sanding screen. Just a quick. Hit it quickly and then I'll sponge it off. What you don't want is, I didn't do it as an example of what not to do, but if your water is too hot and you mix too long and you wait too long, if your plaster is very thick in your bucket and you go to pour it in here, it won't level out. It'll kind of like come out in clumps. So you don't want to get to that point. If anything, it'd be better to pour it wetter than more set up. So you get a nice even pour and a flat top. So whenever I'm working, if I do see those ridges when I swirl my finger, I immediately pour, because it just means once it starts to set up, it sort of accelerates in terms of solidifying. So you want to like really get it in here. So when you're setting up your space, you want to be very intentional about where things are, and you want everything set up so when you do mix your plaster and it's ready to go, you can just easily come over here without even thinking about it. So keeping it really smooth is a good idea. Any other questions for me? Comments, sharing? I'd love to see you guys in a mold making class if you're interested, or any other class that we have going on. We've got a ton of classes. If you're local, I think I mentioned that we're selling plaster here, and we can weigh out your 5 pounds or whatever you need. Just let us know.
So Kayla,
Yeah.
I just had an idea for a short class for you to offer, perhaps. And that would be how to recycle your clay in a small home studio, because you were talking about using that plaster slab for redoing that.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be kind of interesting. I mean, that's one of the problems that I have, and I'm always, I don't know, it would be nice just to know, okay, you can do step 1, step 2, step 3 to recycle smaller batches of clay would be nice.
Okay. Yeah, and there's a few different ways to do it too. You don't need plaster. So I think yeah, that would be a good one.
Good.
Do you let your stuff dry out, or do you put it in a wet bucket?
Yeah, I've done both.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah. You don't have to do it now. That's a class.
That's a class.
That's a class.
For sure. I definitely recommend wetting it down though, and like starting with that and then drying it out. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you all so much. I think what I'll do, I have the link for the YouTube video all ready to go, so I can send that to you today with the plaster chart and everything. I'll send that to you right now after the class. And then the video of the class with me talking, that will process and probably be ready tomorrow or Monday, just so you know, but I'll get that to you too. And just thank you all, and feel free to email me or use the Facebook page to share ideas and ask questions.
Thanks, Kayla.
Good luck. Good luck.
Thank you very much. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.